Hello, and welcome back to the Writers Craft Summit. In this session, I'm speaking with author and writing instructor, Jay Thorn. Jay, welcome to the summit.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm excited to be here.
So in this session, we're going to dig into how someone can take an idea and turn it into an outline for a story or a novel.
That is correct, yes.
So is this something that you've ever struggled with, or is it something that's always come pretty easy to you?
No, this is not, it hasn't come easy to me. I think like a lot of entrepreneurs, we find problems and we have to scratch our own itch. And then sometimes we look around and find out that other people are having those same problems. So I've been working on a story methodology since around 2009 when I first started writing novels. And really had made great strides when I found Sean Coyne and StoryGrid, and was just so excited to become a StoryGrid certified editor and to work with Sean. And so my experience with StoryGrid and writing my own stuff, and then writing with my partner, Zach Bohannon from Molten Universe Media, sort of developed this methodology because a lot of what Sean's StoryGrid stuff focuses on is revision. And I thought, what if I take some of these principles and apply it to pre-production so that by the time you get to the point where you're ready to write a draft, you at least have a game plan.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Sean is one of the other guests at this summit. So there's great synergy here.
Yes. I have tremendous respect for Sean, and I think he's brilliant. So if you guys are out there listening, you've got to make sure you watch Sean's.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's dig into it. I can't wait to hear what you've got lined up for us here. All
right. Great. So we're calling this story levels, and basically what story levels is, it's a layered approach where you take an idea that you have for a novel. And I think we've all been in that situation. I'm sure you have as well, Kevin, where you're at a cocktail party or you're at a social gathering and someone says, "Oh, you're a writer. I have this great idea." And you're like, "Wow, thanks, but I have a million of those." It seems like we have a ton of ideas, but turning those ideas into reality is where the challenge is, and it's also where the fun is. But so I thought, what if we had a methodology where we could take that idea and then work it through a process, through a system, and then you'd be ready to write. And I think it became even more important when I started co-writing and working with Zach, because it's one thing when the whole story's inside your head. You can kind of do what you want whenever you feel like it. But when you're trying to write with somebody else, you need a plan. And so I think it was born out of necessity and something that we applied. I've been doing this for 10 years. He's been doing it for 5. And so we brought all of our knowledge and our experience in writing and publishing into this. And we're excited to roll out story levels a little bit later this year.
Fantastic. It's funny when you mention this plethora of ideas. You mentioned also what it's like being an entrepreneur. And I was once in a community, an online community of entrepreneurs. And I just remember in the forum once, a guy came on and he said, guys, I'm not really good at the implementation and operationalization, but if you need ideas, you just come to me because I am an idea man. And I was like, dude, we're all ideas.
Yes.
Like, are you kidding me? And obviously idea women as well. Like, that's the easy part, man.
Right.
That's like walking into a room and saying, hey, you want me to do all the easy part for you? Like, no, we all have a million ideas. How do we turn those ideas into reality? That's right. The hard work, and that's what we're going to talk about here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, that's so true. So I thought what I would do is just sort of give an introduction to everyone and let them know what story levels is and what you can do with it. And I think the good news too that I'll mention now is that Zach and I are working on story levels together. It's going to be a book, but we're going to blog to book it first. So if anyone's out there, you'll be able to get all this for free when it comes out later this year. So I just wanted to kind of mention that too.
Yeah, and for someone who's maybe not familiar with that term, blog to book, what does that mean?
What it means is we're going to write the book, and we are going to have it edited. Sean Coyne and Black Irish Books are going to publish it. It's going to be a legitimate book that you can buy at all major retailers and bookstores. But what we're doing is we're going to release sections at a time on a blog. And so people can go and they can read it. It might be once a week or once every other week, but the entire book will show up as a blog series. And then for convenience and for people who are interested, they can then purchase the book once the series is over.
Yeah, I think that's so fantastic because it starts that discussion about the book, right? It gives people that opportunity to start digesting the ideas in it. But then obviously we all love books too, right? Like
Yeah.
just because you read something, if you read something on a blog and it really resonated with you, you want that book. You want it all together on your Kindle or on your shelf or whatever. So I love that model.
Exactly. Yeah, and Sean has the entire StoryGrid book up on the blog, and he's had it since the beginning, but fans of StoryGrid will buy the book anyway. So it works out for everybody.
Absolutely.
All right, so how about if I run you through the 7 levels and sort of give folks an idea what this is all about?
This isn't like the 7 levels of hell here, right? this is going to be a little more positive, I hope, right?
I sure hope so. Yeah, and I think too, a lot of what Zach and I have been working on with story levels are taking other methodologies and sort of blending them into our own, which is what Sean did with StoryGrid as well. So even though I might not specifically talk about it today, this is incorporating elements of the hero's journey, the Virgin's Promise, Save the Cat, The War of Art. I mean, all of those great both writing and mindset books that we all love, we've sort of taken pieces and parts of those, including StoryGrid, and formulated them into a pre-production plan. So the first one is, the first level is called the pitch and log line. And basically this is the idea part. And there's a great, Daniel Pink in his book did a great little exercise on the Pixar pitch. Folks can look that up if they're interested. But really what it's a formulaic way of taking an idea, standardizing it, and then being able to compare it with other ideas. So for level 1, what you'd want to do is you'd want to bring, say, 3 or 4 of your best ideas and sort of lay them out on the table and pick the one that looks most interesting to you. And that would be level 1. And Stephen King is famous for saying, like, if in On Writing, he said, if you have an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation, that's usually a good story idea. So folks are looking for some way to, to get started on that. So basically at level 1, you're doing either a Pixar pitch or the logline exercise from Save the Cat. And what you're really trying to do is come up with that golden idea. Or even if you don't know if it's golden, it's got to be the one you're most interested in writing, because you're going to be living with it through pre-production, through the drafting, through revisions, could be months or years. So you want to really make sure it's something you like.
And I love this idea of pulling from Hollywood methodologies like the Save the Cat stuff, because there's this history in cinema of a system for developing ideas and for pitching ideas and for breaking down stories, largely due to the necessity of the medium. Like film, you could only fit so many minutes on a reel, and you could only show so many hours in the theater before you start cutting into profits and all of that. There's this whole industry around the shape and look of film, which necessitated writers developing all of these kind of frameworks and ideas and strategies. And now that we're in this world of indie publishing or this world of traditional, where there's a lot more support, I think it's really smart for novelists to carry over some of those ideas from cinema and from screenwriting into their own creative work, because now we are our own gatekeepers now, and we're the ones we kind of have to box ourselves in a little bit so that we can focus in on certain ideas.
Yeah, so true. And Christopher Vogler's book and Robert McKee's book are both really important parts of story levels as well. So I think your point about using the tools that filmmakers have for novelists is very appropriate.
Yeah, it's funny when people talk about this, the hero's journey, they're actually almost always talking about Vogler's hero's journey and not Campbell's. It's really interesting the way Vogler's actually kind of superseded Campbell in how we think of the hero's journey. Really.
Yeah, that's so true. It's so true. Yeah. All right, so that's level 1, pitch and log line. Level 2 then is you take your idea and you try and create the big 5 global commandments. Now this is directly from StoryGrid. So Sean Coyne, I'm sure we'll go into more detail on this, but the 5 global commandments of any story are the inciting incident, progressive complication / turning point, crisis, climax, resolution. And again, there's some analogy to the film world, but basically the inciting incident starts the story. The progressive complication turning point is the moment where our hero or our lead character is forced into action. The crisis is the big decision facing that character in the story. The climax is the consequence of that decision, and then the resolution is the new normal. And again, Sean will go into much more detail, but basically that's story level number 2, where you've gone from the pitch and the log line to now building it out to these 5 global commandments. And you think of these as sort of mile markers on a highway. You're going to have a lot of space to fill in between, but you kind of need to know where you're starting and where you're ending, and about 3 points in between.
Yeah, in our conversation with Sean, he's actually focusing in just on the Bell story curve. And so don't worry at all about, you're not repeating yourself if you dig into any other story grid stuff here. So
great. Okay, super. So yeah, that's story level 2. And then what you would do in the next level, story level 3, is you take those 5 global commandments and you replicate the process for each act. So if you break it up into a 3-act structure, you would have 5 commandments for Act 1, 5 for 2, 5 for 3, and that's what Sean calls the 15 obligatory scenes. This becomes the spine of your story. Now I know that there's sort of this, I call it a false dichotomy in the writing world of plotter versus pantser. People who like to plot out what they're going to write versus discovery writers who just kind of sit down and write whatever they want. And I think that if you use something like story levels, you get the best of both worlds, because what we're doing is we're creating these 15 obligatory scenes and fleshing out the world. But if you think about a novel, which might have, let's say, 70 chapters roughly, that means you have 55 other chapters that if you are a pantser, you can pants most of the book anyways. But having those 15 obligatory scenes, 5 for each act, make sure you don't go so far off on a tangent that you're going to end up chucking 30,000 words because they don't fit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny. People are always like, you can pants it, you can plan it. Both work. I I totally disagree. I really think you should plan. I'm so biased. I know like the political answer to say, listen, everything works. And actually that's, throughout this summit, that has been the message throughout, that like we're presenting different ideas, different approaches, things that you could try that may or may not work for you. But almost across the board, I've seen planning ahead and knowing the fundamentals of your craft pay off in a way that makes further revisions easier. And that's it. Like, absolutely, you can make up a first draft as you go, but I've never seen someone make up the first draft as they go and then not have intense revisions that perhaps could have been avoided if even just a little bit of the planning work we're talking about here had been done.
Yes, and I'm going to come back to that with a few examples for story level 7, which is the outline. So I'm glad you brought that up. So then that's 3. So story level 4 is called the premise. And really what we're looking at here, this is a big nod to Stephen Pressfield, who does a lot of work around symbolism and theme. But really what you're trying to do with the premise is you're trying to come up with the theme or the controlling idea. And the way that you get to that is you ask yourself, what's it really about, right? So you can have a movie that's about a guy whose family is kidnapped, but what's it really about? Well, it might really be about the fact that we're not as safe as we think we are and we live in a dangerous world. I'm just kind of making that up. So that's something that's really important that comes out in story levels on level 4. The other thing you want to do in level 4 for story levels is you want to identify the genre. And that is so incredibly important, especially for independent publishers. You need to look at the internal and external story genres, as Sean Coyne does in StoryGrid. And you also must look at the commercial genre, because when you get to the marketplace, you kind of have to know what tag to put on it, what virtual shelf it sits on. So all of that can be baked into the premise. And it doesn't mean that you have it all figured out before you sit down to write. In fact, a lot of times the theme doesn't really emerge until you're done. But at least you have an intention. You sort of have a guiding principle. And I think that, tied to the genre, will really help you stay focused on the type of story you want to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this stage of identifying what you're calling the premise here, your message of the story, is so important and something that some people don't think about, right? They'll write an entire great novel or first draft of a novel, but then it's like, what do you actually have to say about the world? Like, we aren't just storytellers. We are commenting on what it's like to be a human being, on what it's like to live in a certain society or to go through a certain experience, right? And you really do. Maybe you're just a creative person who loves to tell stories, but at some point you have to sit down and have a point of view on the world.
Yes. Yes. And there's a lot of talk right now around AI and what the role of artificial intelligence will be in the creative expressions, music, art, writing. And I do think at some point in the faraway future, AI will write stories, will write novels. But I think this is you're extremely correct here, in that this is a thing that's very human. You can write a really interesting sequence of events, but that doesn't make it an interesting story. And so the way you make it an interesting story is you say something with it. So I would totally agree with that. And I think that's why for story levels, we believe that's an important component that you need to address before you even begin writing.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. So that brings us to story level number 5. And this is the characters. Now, Zach and I, in our process, we believe characters revealed. So we don't spend a ton of time on creating very detailed, expansive character bios with favorite colors and who their third grade teacher was and that sort of stuff. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that if you enjoy that type of activity. But what we find is that if we focus on the simple wants and needs of the characters, a lot of times defined by like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you take a look at those different level of needs and you compare what characters want versus what they need, and you identify that for your entire cast, that's going to give you enough flavor that you can then use that to move forward and start to build out the world. So story levels, level 5 is doing what we call a casting call. So we'll go and find images of actors or actresses in certain roles, and we don't share those or use those, but those become the framework or our mental image for who those characters are going to be. And then when you build in the wants and needs, you usually have enough to then start your story and make it rich.
That process is something that is really common in, say, painting, right? Like, there's no question a painter is going to like put a bowl of fruit out and then reference it,
Yeah.
right? Whereas for some reason, the writing world, we think we have to come up with everything out of our minds whole cloth, right? And it's like, no, there's, especially with like Pinterest and stuff now, there's so many opportunities to go and find reference images. And so I love that you've worked that into your process.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think if you're in any type of collaborative effort like I am with Zach, you need that. Like because if he's describing a character one way, my descriptions have to be consistent. And the easiest way to do that is that we agree on a visual representation of the character. So there's a very practical reason for it as well.
Absolutely.
So that's story level 4, or I'm sorry, 5. Story level 6 is the world. And depending on the genre that you're writing in, you may or may not have a lot of work to do in story level 6, because if you're writing, say, a contemporary literature, or you're writing in some type of contemporary story, you don't have to create the world and all the rules because it's what we all live in. But if you're writing something like, space opera or epic fantasy or historical fiction, then you are going to need to build the world. So what we look at in story level 6 is we say, okay, so if we're going to set the story in a particular world, then we also need to know what is different or unique or engaging about this world that a reader is going to care about. And the way we get to that is we say, okay, something is wrong with this world. What is it? And that's what you got to figure out. So no matter what your story is, if you take that world and you make one thing about it off or wrong or different, it's going to be hooky enough to keep that reader reading. So that's what we do in story level 6 is we try and find, first we build out the basics of the world. We look at, environment, setting, rules, laws, factions, government, whatever it happens to be. But then we're also looking for what's wrong or what's different. And that's story level 6.
Something I've seen here too is working in contemporary fantasy or fantasy of any kind is getting the rules around the magic. Because I'm working with a client right now and we've been revising, and I'm not the biggest world building fan. And so we were kind of putting it off. And just like this month, we've hit a point where we're like, oh my God, we got to figure out the rules here. Like sometimes they have wands, sometimes there's like spells, sometimes there's a cauldron, sometimes there's like just psychic telekinetic magic going on. And we were like, okay, we really got to figure this stuff out. And it's just one of those examples like we were talking about where if you do this stuff beforehand, you don't have to go back and kind of retroactively fix it all halfway through a draft or a revision or whatnot.
Yes. Yep. That's a perfect transition to story level 7, which is the outline. So I think we all know what an outline is, and I know that there are some pantsers who might be bristling at even the term outline. You could call it beats, you could call it a plan, whatever you want, but basically the whole story levels process builds to this singular document that you then use, and it guides you through the draft. And the reason that's really important is every day when I sit down to type my words and I open up Scrivener or Word or a Google Doc and I'm staring at that expansive white space, I'm not thinking like, well, what am I writing about? I know. And so the outline can be as simple as a few bullet points. It could be more extensive. It could be a paragraph or so per chapter. But basically, all the story levels builds to this plan so that when you sit down in the chair, you know exactly what it is you're tackling, and you do that every single day because we only have a certain number of minutes, decision calories, if you will. And once you use those up during your day, you become tired. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to eliminate all the resistance that I might face prior to sitting my butt in the chair and putting my hands on the keyboard. And so I think an outline is really important for that reason. And as we talked about earlier, yes, you can absolutely write a first draft and pants it and discovery write. You absolutely can. However, and I think most pantsers will admit this, it means you're going to have a lot more work to do afterwards because you are going to write scenes that don't work. You're going to realize you're missing scenes. I mean, that happens to me, and I'm an outliner. So pantsing, you might end up rewriting half the novel. It might take you twice as long to produce it. Now, if that's not an issue for you, then it doesn't matter, and your system works, and you should be fine with it. But if you're feeling like, wow, I think there might be a better way, there probably is.
And the funny thing is, I think you alluded to it earlier, it almost is a false dichotomy. When you say planner or pantser, we all end up doing the same work. It's kind of just the order that you do it in. And I think you and I both agree it tends to be easier if you do all this work at the beginning rather than do a whole draft and then have to retroactively apply it. But that said, even if I know I'm writing scene 14 today, and in scene 14, a woman and a man go out for a date, and I know that she's going to need to get pissed off and storm out by the end of it. There's a whole lot of room for creativity within that scene. Like, I think there's some sort of misconception that, like, just because you thought out something ahead or did some planning means, like, there's no creativity. I mean, every time I sit down to write, just because I know what needs to happen in that scene doesn't mean that there's not. Every sentence is an act of creativity and an act of discovery to get them from point A to point B.
So well said. I'm a discovery writer too. It just happens to be in the outline. And I think like there's so many real world analogies that it's almost silly when you think about it, but like you would never get in a car and be like, all right, I'm going on vacation. And someone said, where are we going? I don't know. I'm just going to drive. Like, you're probably not going to have a great vacation. Or a construction crew doesn't show up on site with a stack of materials and someone's like, all right, so what are we building? I don't know. Let's just throw something together and we'll fix it later. Like, those kinds of things, they're silly, but they don't really happen because there's so much work that's involved later. So again, I think it is very important to stress that there is no one right way to write. You certainly can pants through a draft, but you just have to recognize that you are then putting a lot of your calories on the back end as opposed to someone who's outlining, who's putting them on the front end. And I would argue even more that I think you're saving even more time because if you do it on the front end, then you don't end up writing stuff you don't need, which will definitely happen if you do it on the back end.
Definitely. All right, well, Jay, thank you so much. Let's review here. So we've got... Well, I'll let you do it. Let's run through one more time here our 7 levels. Yeah,
the seven story levels are, number 1, the pitch and the log line. Number 2 is the big 5 global commandments. Number 3 is the 15 obligatory scenes, 5 for each act. Number 4 is the premise, and that's where we talk about identifying the genre and the theme or controlling idea. Number 5 is the characters, focusing on their wants and needs. Number 6 is the world where the story is taking place and trying to find something wrong with it that's interesting. And number 7 is creating the beats or the outline.
Fantastic. At the beginning, you mentioned you are working on the book covering all of this material. Where can people go if they want to learn more, if they want to make sure they don't miss the blog post, if they want to get the book or work with you, all of that stuff?
Yeah, super easy. If you go to storylevels.com, there's a little form there. You just put in your email address, and as soon as everything's available, you'll be the first to know. It'll be waiting for you in your inbox.
I love it. Well, Jay, thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the Writers Craft Summit and to go over this amazing planning process. I love it. And I think the people watching are going to find it really helpful when they put it to use in their own planning.
I hope so. My pleasure, Kevin. I'm honored to be part of this.